For those of you who are not familiar with the book of Revelation, the four horsemen of the apocalypse correspond with the first four seals in chapter 6. When the first seal is broken, a rider on the white horse appears. Now that rider is the Antichrist. And the reason we took kind of a break and we went to the book of Daniel is because, as I said, the rider on the white horse is the Antichrist, and I wanted you to know a little bit about the Antichrist and where we're getting all of this information. And where we're getting all the information about the Antichrist is in the book of Daniel. So when we finish that, now we're heading back in. But the rider on the white horse is the Antichrist. The color white symbolizes peace, because when the Antichrist first comes on the scene, he brokers or negotiates a peace treaty with Israel, and he allows them to rebuild the temple. Now when the second seal is broken, a rider on a red horse appears. This rider is going to usher in World War III. Ezekiel's chapter 38 and 39 detail the events of this war. When the third seal is broken, a rider on a black horse appears. This rider is going to bring famine upon the world. It's the after effects of World War III. When the fourth seal is broken, the last horseman is unleashed upon the world. This pale rider brings death with him, and a quarter of the earth is affected. In fact, I'm always reminded of Clint Eastwood's movie, Pale Rider. Do you remember that? When he comes riding on the Appaloosa or the pale horse, and she's reading this section of Revelation. Well, trust me, it's going to be much scarier when it really happens. Now, these four horsemen bring deceit, destruction, and devastation upon the world. You might say they kick off the tribulation. They get it all started. In fact, when you see the first horseman come on the scene, the tribulation has begun. And by the time the fourth horseman is on the scene, the tribulation is in full swing. It's too late. If you miss the rapture, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to endure. And everything has already been set in motion. Now, we've already studied the first horseman, which we found out is the Antichrist. So now we're going to move on to study the second horseman, the one that ushers in World War III. So turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 6. Let's read verses 3 and 4. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. Now, first of all, I want you to notice the color of the horse. It's red. Red is the color of blood. So we can tell just by the color of the horse that the rider is bringing bloodshed. The second thing that I want you to notice is that this horseman is going to take peace from the earth. And he's going to cause people to kill one another. Now that's a horrible translation. Because when we read that, well, all right, people are going to kill one another. But it's worse than that. The word kill is the Greek word spatzo. That's right, spatzo, which means to slay, to slaughter, to butcher. You see, kill doesn't accurately convey the true meaning of the word spatzo. Slaughter does. The rider is going to take peace from the world, and he's going to cause people to slaughter one another. And just to make sure that you understand what's going to happen when this rider comes on the scene, verse 4 ends with, "And there was given unto him a great sword." Of course, the word sword symbolizes what? War. So this rider is unleashing war upon the earth. But if you think about it, there's been a lot of wars on this earth. Some big, some small. In fact, in the 20th century alone, we've had more than 100 wars. In fact, what I did was I got on Google, and I wanted to see just how many wars we've had just in the 20th century. And there's 4 pages listing all the wars that happened from 1901 all the way to the end, or right up into 2000. And what's interesting is over 160 million people have died as a result of just those wars. But we've only had 2 great wars in the last century. What were the 2 great wars? World War I and World War II. Now, according to verse number 4, the rider on the red horse will be given a great sword, indicating that this is going to be a great war. You see, the word great is translated from the Greek word megas. In fact, our English word mega is transliterated from this Greek word. And what does mega mean? Mega means huge. So this is going to be a huge war. It's going to be World War III. It will literally take peace from all of the earth, not just from a portion of it, because so many nations are going to be involved, or all the nations are going to take sides. And millions are going to be slaughtered. In fact, so many people are going to be slaughtered that it's going to take the Jews 7 months just to bury everyone who died in this war. Now, how do I know all of this? I know all of this not from the book of Revelation, but from the book of Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel tells us exactly what's going to happen when the rider on the red horse appears and he takes peace from the earth. So let's look at what the book of Ezekiel has to say about World War III. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 37. How many of you know what chapter 37 is about? Anyone? It's the valley of the dry bones. Hopefully you looked on your notes and you could have said, I knew that, it's on the notes. Now, this particular vision foretells the rebirth of Israel as a nation. Now, some of you might be wondering what this has to do with World War III. And my answer to you is everything. You see, World War III occurs because a League of Nations decide to invade Israel, to wipe the Jews off of the face of the earth. And if Israel wasn't a nation, then World War III would never occur. I'm not saying there wouldn't be a World War III, but it wouldn't be for this reason. So the first event that has to happen before the tribulation can ever take place is the rebirth of Israel as a nation. And we know that that's already occurred. And that's what the vision of the valley of the dry bones is all about. So let me give you a quick synopsis of Ezekiel's vision. In the vision, Ezekiel saw this valley of dry bones. The bones were the remains of a defeated army that were slaughtered and left unburied to decompose into a sun-bleached pile of bones. Any of you ever been going or walking through a field and all of a sudden you come upon maybe the skull of a cow or a horse or something like that, and it's set in the sun so long it's sun-bleached? Or maybe some of you just like that look, and so you went out and you bought one that has horns and everything. Anyone have that sitting on their porch? Well, you know, that's what he's talking about. Sun-bleached bones. They've been there forever. All the small animals have gnawed all the meat off of them. The ants have come. There's nothing left there but bones. And that's what Ezekiel saw. The bones were the remains of this defeated army. Now, these bones represent Israel as a nation. And the reason we know that is because verse 11 tells us that. Look at verse 11. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones represent the people of Israel. They are saying, we have become old, dry bones. All hope is gone. Our nation is finished. Why? Because they've been carried into captivity. And you actually had two different ones. When the nation of Israel divided, they divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, from the time it divides, is always referred to as Israel. The southern kingdom is always referred to as Judah. So 10 tribes of the north, they separated from the 2 tribes in the south. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that the Assyrians came and they carried the northern tribes away into captivity. And in order to try and assimilate people that they conquered, what they would normally do is they would cause them to intermarry. And that's why when Jesus Christ comes on the scene and the people are there always against the Samaritans, the reason they're against the Samaritans is because they're half-breeds. They had intermarried with people who were not Jews. They had not kept their lineage pure. The only ones that kept their lineage pure were the southern tribes. And then when they were carried off into captivity, into the Babylonian captivity, they thought, well, it's all over. We've been dispersed throughout all of the nation. And then, of course, after 70 AD, we see that really happen. All of the Jews went everywhere, and they weren't even in their nation. So, Ezekiel is looking at the dry bones, and God asked him a question. He asked Ezekiel, can these bones live? Look at verse 3. Then he asked, talking about God, Son of man, can these bones become living people again? O sovereign Lord, I replied, you alone know the answer to that. Now, we know that these bones represent Israel, so what God was really asking Ezekiel was this. Can the nation of Israel, that's dead and scattered throughout the world, become a nation again? That's what God was really asking. And after God asked that question, Ezekiel saw these bones come together to form a complete skeleton. And then he saw muscle and flesh begin to cover the bones until they were people. They looked alive again. Look at verse 7 and 8. So I spoke this message just as he told me to. In other words, he prophesied to the bones. Suddenly, as I spoke, there was a rattling noise all across the valley. Why? Because now these bones are getting up, almost like an animation. And these bones are coming together and they're clacking against one another. And then the bones of each body came together and attached themselves as complete skeletons. Then as I watched, muscles and flesh formed over the bones. Then skin formed to cover their bodies. But they still had no breath in them. Now, who do the bones represent? Verse 11 told us? Israel, the nation of Israel. So Ezekiel saw Israel being restored as a nation once more. And that happened when? In 1948. God brought the Jews from all over the world back to Israel. In other words, the bones came together. And then the muscles and the flesh covered the bones, which means they became recognized as a nation once more. But I want you to notice that the bodies were without breath. They didn't have any breath in them. Now, that's very significant. Let me explain why. Even though Israel is a nation again, it is not spiritually alive. It's currently without life. Breath symbolizing life. But what's going to happen during the tribulation? During the tribulation, Israel as a whole is going to come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. At that time, spiritual life will be breathed into the nation of Israel, and Israel will become not just God's chosen people, but God's family, just as the church is. Now, we asked this question when we were looking at the purpose of the tribulation. And I told you that God had a plan. When it came time to redeem the earth, and that's what the scroll is all about. When he begins to undo the seals, that's a scroll that he's rolling out, and that scroll is the title deed to earth. So when Jesus takes the scroll, he is taking the title deed to earth. He is now coming to claim his possession. But the reason it takes 7 years to do this is because God has a purpose. And the main purpose is to bring the nation of Israel as a whole unto a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Now, Israel becoming a nation sets the stage for World War III. Because, as I said before, World War III wouldn't occur if Israel wasn't a nation. Because the whole reason that World War III occurs is because the League of Nations decides to invade Israel, to wipe them off the face of the earth, and to plunder what they have. You know, what's kind of interesting is the last time that we were at Israel, we were going through the Red Sea, and then we came up through Israel, and we were on the Mediterranean Sea and looked out, and there were some oil rigs out there. And I didn't realize this. They're discovering oil right off the coast of Israel. What do you think that's going to do? Very interesting. So now we're ready to see the prophecies concerning World War III in chapters 38 and 39. But first I need to clear up some misperceptions that some of you probably had or have. And the reason I need to do that is because some of you probably own commentaries. How many of you have a commentary on the book of Revelation? You've been reading it as you're going along? Probably so. And if you've been reading some of these commentaries by scholars, you have probably seen that many of these scholars believe that the battle in Ezekiel 37 and 38 is the battle of Armageddon. And it's not. This is a completely different battle than the battle of Armageddon. This battle takes place at the beginning of the tribulation, not the end. And let me explain how I know that. Because the battle of Armageddon is here at the end of Revelation. And the reason it's at the end of Revelation is because the battle of Armageddon is the climax to the 7 years known as the tribulation. So if Ezekiel 37 and 38, the battle that's there, is describing the battle of Armageddon, something's wrong. Because this battle takes place at the first of the tribulation. And I'm going to show you how I know that. All right? First of all, the nations involved are specifically mentioned are a selective few. But in the battle of Armageddon, all of the nations are involved. Secondly, the invasion comes from the north. But in the battle of Armageddon, it comes from every side. Why? Because every nation is coming. Thirdly, there's a protest against this invasion. You find that in verse number 13. In the battle of Armageddon, there's no protest. Why is there no protest? Because all of the nations are involved and they're all coming for this one purpose. Fourthly, Gog heads the invasion. We're going to find out that Gog is not a country. Gog is a person. Actually, it's a title, so he's referring to a person. But what's interesting is Gog is the leader of the invasion. But in the Battle of Armageddon, who's the leader of that? The beast, the Antichrist. Fifthly, the invasion is stopped by an earthquake and what I believe are nuclear weapons. You'll find that in verses 20 through 22. But in the Battle of Armageddon, the invaders are destroyed by the sword of the mouth that comes out of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ returns, and all Jesus has to do is speak the word. Now, all of these people are prepared for battle. Even when Jesus begins to come on his white horse with all of us, his armies behind him, they're still ready to do battle. But we don't have to do battle. All Jesus has to do is speak the word, and the sword comes out of his mouth, and it destroys them. Sixthly, the invasion that Ezekiel describes takes place while Israel is living securely in their land. In other words, they're living in peace. But the Battle of Armageddon takes place while Israel is in flight and in hiding. Remember, we went back to the book of Daniel, and what we found out is that in the middle of the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to come in, and he's going to say, I'm God, or I'm as great as God, worship me. And he's going to seek to change the times and the law. And when he seeks to do that, the Jews are going to say, you can't do that. God showed us in the Levitical law how we are to serve him and how we're to offer up offerings of worship. And when they say no, the Antichrist is going to turn on them. They're going to have to flee into the wilderness, which I believe is Petra. And when they flee, guess what? They're no longer living in security and peace. But this battle takes place when they're living in peace. And last but not least, the battle that Ezekiel describes takes place at the beginning of the tribulation. And I'm going to show you why in just a little bit why I believe that. And the Battle of Armageddon takes place in the tribulation. And as I said, I'm going to prove that in just a little bit. Just hang on. So the battle that Ezekiel's describing is not the Battle of Armageddon. It is World War III, initiated by the rider on the red horse when the second seal is opened. And I'm going to explain how I know that. Just hold on. But first, let's see who's involved in this invasion of Israel. Turn to verses 1 through 6 in Ezekiel 38. This is another message that came to me from the Lord. Son of man, turn and face Gog of the land of Magog, the prince who rules over the nations of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Give him this message from the sovereign Lord. Gog, I am your enemy. I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaws to lead you out with your whole army. Your horses and charioteers in full armor and great horde armed with shields and swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya will join you too with all their weapons. Gomer and all its armies will also join you, along with the armies of Beth Togarmah from the distant north and many others. Now, as I said, Gog is not a country. Gog is a title like Pharaoh, Caesar, or president. It's not a country, it is a person. And God is addressing him by his title. Now, the other names listed are actually geographical locations. So we have to ascertain what countries are involved by looking at the geographical locations that are listed. Now, rather than going and looking at all the geographical locations that are listed and showing you which countries they represent, I'm going to bypass that because of time, and I'm just going to tell you the countries that are involved. Is that okay? Good. Because it gets kind of boring. Magog is Russia. So these are the ones that are involved. Russia, the Islamic Southern Republics of the former Soviet Union, Turkey, Iran, which is also known as Persia, Sudan, Libya, and most of the Islamic Middle East countries such as Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, etc. Now, every one of these nations that are listed, these locations that were listed, are all Muslim countries with the exception of Russia. Every one of these countries are Muslim. Russia is considered still kind of an atheist one, all right? So these are the nations that's going to invade Israel when the second seal is opened. Now, how do I know that this war is going to happen when the second seal is opened? How do we know that this war is going to take place at the beginning of the tribulation, and this is not the Battle of Armageddon that takes place at the end of the tribulation? Well, Ezekiel gave us several clues as to when this war is going to take place. First, he says it's going to happen during the end times. Look at verse number 16. And you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It will come about in the last days that I shall bring you against my land, in order that the nations may know me when I shall be sanctified through you before their eyes, O Gog. Now that phrase, in the last days, refers to the end times. It refers to the tribulation period. So it's going to happen during the tribulation. So now we've narrowed this battle down to when? The 7-year period to the tribulation. But we still don't know when it occurs during this tribulation period. So let's go on. He also says that Israel will not only be a nation at the time of the invasion, but they're going to be at peace, and they're going to be living securely in their land. Now, this is really important, because ever since Israel has become a nation, they've been in conflict with all of the other Middle East nations that's been around them. True? Yes. You know, it's kind of interesting when we went into Egypt. One of the things that they tell you when you go into Egypt or any of the Muslim countries, don't discuss politics. Don't do it. And so what's interesting is we went into Egypt, and then we went into Jordan, and we were at Aqaba, and we decided that night to go walking around, and I was walking around, and they have 24-hour cafes. And so when we were there was a really friendly young man, and they recognized immediately that we were Americans. And so he's trying to get us to come in. And then he wants to know who we're going to vote for. Are you going to vote for McCain or Obama? And you know, I'm not supposed to talk politics, and I can tell. He said, I really don't care. But then he starts telling me how great Obama is, and how Obama is the man, and no one respects Bush, and all of these different things. But what's kind of interesting about this is they don't like Israel. They can't stand Israel. And so ever since Israel's been a nation, they understood that if they were going to survive, they were going to have a strong military, because they've been in constant conflict with the other Muslim nations around them. Look at verse number 11. Verse 11 says, you will say, talking to Israel, or talking to God, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. People, that's not like that over in Israel. Let me tell you, getting across their border takes a long time. We got ready to come home, and we were going to the airport. The first stop is 2 miles from the airport. That bus has to pull over, and they look underneath your bus. They open everything up. They come inside. And the reason they do that is because if you run that security zone toward the airport, they have enough time, and it's a winding road to get to the airport. They have enough time to radio up there, and you would not believe the military that will be there immediately. They are living securely in their land, but they are a very suspecting people. They suspect everyone as terrorists. They want to know if you have any family over there. They want to know if you have any family from any other countries around and surrounding Israel. Why? Because they've been in constant conflict. But verse number 11 says that when this battle occurs, this is a peaceful people. They are unsuspecting. There are no walls. There are no gates. Everything has been opened up. Now, when will Israel have peace? When the first seal is opened. The whole reason we went to the book of Daniel was to find out about the Antichrist, because when the first seal is opened and the white horseman comes, white symbolizes peace. He's the Antichrist. And what initiates the tribulation is the Antichrist comes up, and you probably won't even suspect he's the Antichrist unless you've listened to my teachings on Revelation and you're left behind. But if you've been left behind, if a man is able to come up and negotiate a peace treaty with Israel, you're going to recognize this is the Antichrist, because the book of Daniel chapter 7 tells us exactly what the Antichrist is going to do. He is going to establish how long of a peace treaty? Oh, come on, people. We spent so many time in Daniel. 7 years. So how long is the tribulation? 7 years. So at the beginning of the tribulation, it starts with the peace treaty. The Antichrist comes on the scene and there's a peace treaty. And guess what? For the first time, Israel lets down their guard. For the first time, they're unsuspecting. For the first time, just like the wall in Berlin went down, you're going to see the walls between Palestinians and Israelites come down. There's not going to be the gates. It's going to come in because this person is able to broker a peace treaty that the Israelites believe in. Does that make sense? So that tells us that these people are living in peace. They're living in their own border. And that's when Israel is going to be a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. And that's going to happen in the beginning. So this tells me all of a sudden this is not the Battle of Armageddon. This is back over here. Thirdly, he tells us it will take 7 months to bury the dead. Look at Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 12 and 13. There's going to be so many people killed in this war that Israel is actually going to set up, did you know this, a temporary city. And the whole purpose of this city is to work around the clock to cleanse the land, to bury all of the dead as a result of this war. Notice what it says in verse number 12 and 13. It will take 7 months for the people of Israel to bury the bodies and cleanse the land. Everyone in Israel will help, for it will be a glorious victory for Israel when I demonstrate my glory on that day, says the sovereign Lord. Now, during the second half of the tribulation, the Jews are fleeing and they're being persecuted. Why? Because as we found out in Daniel, the Antichrist enters in the temple. He sets himself up as God and says, worship me. And he seeks to change the times and the laws, and the Jews say, no way. He turns on the Jews and they have to flee. Now, they cannot be burying the dead for 7 months when they've gone to the wilderness and fleeing. So this has to happen now. We've narrowed it down to the first half of the tribulation, right? Yes, but we're not finished. And last but not least, it will take 7 years to clean up the weapons and the military equipment left behind by those who invaded. Now we're going to read Ezekiel 39, verses 9 and 10. But before we do that, let me ask you a question. If you saw modern warfare in a vision, but you lived in Ezekiel's day, how would you describe it? The only way you can describe it with what you know. All I can tell you is it was like shields because these are armored vehicles. They're bows and arrows, but man, those arrows went out like you wouldn't believe it. And the javelins and spears are like missiles and bombs. So we need to keep that in mind as we read this. Because Ezekiel is in a day where he's never seen modern warfare. So let's read verses 9 and 10. Then the people in towns of Israel will go out and pick up your small and large shields, armored vehicles, bows and arrows, guns, javelins and spears, missiles and bombs. And they will use them for fuel, because there's going to be a lot of fuel there when you see these nations come in. There will be enough to last them, how long? 7 years. They won't need to cut wood from the fields or the forest, for these weapons will give them all the fuel they need. They will plunder those who plan to plunder them, and they will rob those who plan to rob them, says the sovereign Lord. Now, it takes 7 years to clean up the weapons and military equipment that's left behind. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells us that this battle will have to take place at the first part of the first half of the tribulation. Because the tribulation only lasts 7 years. And the second seal is when war begins and peace is taken from the earth. Right? Yes. So it's got to be the second seal. Right at the beginning of the tribulation. You get the peace treaty. Israel lets down their guard. They're living securely in their land. And that's when God takes Gog, it's his title, he's the leader of Russia, and he says, I put a hook in his jaw like you do a fish. And just as you reel that fish in, God's going to reel him in, and he's going to say, look at Israel. And then he's going to go to the countries that hate Israel. He's going to go to the Muslim nations. And he goes, I know they've got a peace treaty, but this is the time. They've let down their guard, and they're going to come. And it's got to be the second seal. Now, if you don't mind, rather than looking at this in detail, I want to kind of summarize what's going to take place when this war breaks out. First of all, when these nations invade Israel, there's going to be a natural catastrophe. An earthquake is going to occur. Look at Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 19 through 20. In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. There is a huge fault that lays there. In fact, if you go to Israel with me, we're going to go to Bethshean, and this was a wonderful city at one time. It was a Roman city that was there. In fact, it's the place that when Saul was killed and they took his body, they actually hung it on the walls. Now, in Christ's day, it was a Roman city. And it's just a fabulous Roman city. And at one time, it had 50,000 people living there. But it was destroyed by an earthquake. It's kind of like California. There is a huge fault that's laying behind that. All right? Or not laying behind it, underneath it. But he says that there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, every creature that moves along the ground, and all the people on the face of the earth, it's going to be felt around the world, will tremble at my presence. The mountains will be overturned, the cliffs will crumble, and every wall will fall to the ground. This earthquake is then going to cause the nations that are invading Israel to turn on each other. They're going to kill each other with friendly fire. Look at verse 21. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. In other words, when this earthquake comes, all of a sudden these mountains are going to begin to fall upon them. And then he says, every man's sword will be against his brother. In other words, they're going to turn on each other. Now, this is kind of interesting, because I believe that nuclear weapons are going to be involved. And I'm going to show you why I believe that. Because when I was writing up this time thing, and everyone wanted to know why it took so long for me to prepare for Revelation, it's because I had to come in and prepare all of this ahead of time. And so I'm writing all of this, and I'm going along, and I'm stealing some of it from other people and going, oh, that makes it nice, and I'll come through here. But what's interesting is, when I come here, I say that it's a nuclear war. Let me show you why I think this is a nuclear war. Look at verse 22. I will punish you and your armies with disease and bloodshed. I will send torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and burning sulfur. Now again, I'm going to ask you the same question I did earlier. If you had a vision of a battle with nuclear weapons, how would you describe it in Ezekiel's day? What would the radiation cause? The worst type of disease you've ever seen. Unbelievable. And it would look like, for several days, torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and burning sulfur. Now, what's kind of interesting, when you study the way that he placed that and the way it's said in the Hebrew, it's almost like it looks like hell on earth is what he's describing. He's saying, what I saw was literally hell on earth. But if you want a better description of what's going to take place, the prophet Zechariah told us what's going to happen in this battle. Look in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 12 through 13. Now, let me just say this as you're turning to the book of Zechariah. A lot of people mistake this because it talks about the return of Jesus in Zechariah 14. So they automatically assume all of this is about the Battle of Armageddon. But Zechariah is different than the other prophets. All he's doing is he's just coming in, he's clumping all of the end times together. So you actually have to take out little pieces and determine where they go in the book of Zechariah. And a lot of scholars don't realize that, so they get these in the wrong places. But Zechariah is talking about this war, and notice what he says in verses 12 through 13. And the Lord will send a plague on all the nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their people will become like walking corpses, their flesh rotting away. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. On that day, they will be terrified, stricken by the Lord with great panic. They will fight their neighbors hand to hand. Now, did you notice that last part in verse 13? That's the friendly fire. there's going to be a nuclear war. And when those begin to come down upon them, they realize what's happening. They so want to get out and they're in their way. They begin to turn on each other, just as Ezekiel said, and they begin to kill each other. Nuclear weapons are used, people, and the invading armies begin to turn on each other. Now, here's what's interesting. It could be, and this is just a theory I have, but I'm reading this and I'm picturing it in my mind. It could be that as they're starting to fire their nuclear weapons, that's when the earthquake occurs. Now, if you're getting ready to send missiles out and you hit it and they start to fire and that earthquake happens, do you think that that projection is going to go the way it was? It's going to fall over and it's going to shoot out. And they're going to begin to turn on each other. And those nuclear weapons are going to be turned on their own allies. That's what I think. I don't know that, but as I read this, and I begin to see that if they turn their swords on each other, in other words, their weapons of warfare on each other, and when I read Zechariah and I see that there's an earthquake involved, it's going to be that Israel is caught off guard. They don't have the ability to come against them. They realize it's over. Iran will have nuclear weapons. Russia will have nuclear weapons. And they're just at God's mercy. And then at the moment that those get ready to be fired at them, bam! God steps in. An earthquake happens, their weapons go down, they begin to fire on each other, and before you know it, they're wiping each other out. And Israel's going to understand this was God. This now becomes a turning point for the nation of Israel. At this point, the nation's eyes are beginning to open. Remember I told you that God has an ulterior motive in having a 7-year tribulation period. Yes, He has several goals, but His main objective is to fulfill His promise to Abraham that Israel as a nation will come into a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ and come back into the family of God. Look at Ezekiel 39, verse 7. I will make known my holy name among my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned, and the nations will know that I, the Lord, am the Holy One in Israel. You see, in all honesty, most Jews profane the name of God. In fact, we actually have a non-believer who was our tour guide, Itai. Itai was not a Messianic Jew. He was a Jew. He had served in the military. He knew all about the history, but he didn't even believe in God. And he told me, as we were talking one day, that the majority of Israelites do not believe in God. Do you know when that turning point really happened? World War II. The Holocaust. God had deserted them. But you know what's interesting? Through World War II, it's because of that the Zionist movement really took hold. Because of what had happened to them, they said, we'll never let this happen. And they made up their minds they're going to bring all of Israel back to Israel. That was the catalyst, the Holocaust, that brought them back to Israel. And the valley of the dry bones was fulfilled. But now they're without spirit. They're not spiritually alive. But when they let their guard down and they have no nuclear weapons to protect themselves, and there's no gates, and they come against them, and they get ready to fire their nuclear weapons, and God causes this great earthquake, and they destroy themselves, they're all going to know that was God. And it's going to be a turning point. And they're no longer going to profane the name of God. They're going to proclaim Him as Yahweh. It's all a part of God's plan to turn Israel to Jesus. He starts by stirring them spiritually. And then their faith in God is restored as they see these prophecies being fulfilled right before their eyes. Now, I personally believe it's going to be this catalyst that also causes 144,000 of them to be converted to Jesus. Now, we talk about the 144,000 sealed, but that's actually an interlude, and I'll explain what an interlude is. In other words, it's not in this chronological time line that we have up here. It just tells us that we have 144,000 Messianic Jews. Now, if there's a Messianic Jew right now, they're going in the rapture because all of the churches go in the rapture. They're not being left behind. It means that 144,000 of them have to be converted. Let me tell you, they're going to be converted because there are Messianic Jews right now that are coming in and they're witnessing about Jesus Christ. And when they see those people gone and they begin to see Ezekiel fulfilled the way it's supposed to, guess what happens? 144,000, I believe, are going to be converted to Christianity. Wow. Now let me add one more thing. We believe that when the Antichrist creates a peace treaty with Israel, he's going to allow them to rebuild the temple. And the reason we believe that is because the temple has to be rebuilt. They have to be offering the sacrifice and offerings. And we know that it happens in the first half of it. So we just naturally assume that it happens when the white horseman comes on the scene. But you know what's interesting? That might not happen until the red horse. And let me explain why I say that. All it really tells us is that when the Antichrist comes on the scene, he negotiates a peace treaty. But it doesn't say that he allows them to rebuild the temple. It just tells us that the temple is rebuilt after that. But you have all these Muslim nations that hate Israel, and the third most holy site is sitting on that Temple Mount, which is the Dome of the Rock. And they don't want that messed up. They don't want the Jews up there. But here's what's interesting. All of these Muslim nations are going to come to invade Israel, and they're going to be wiped out. Now, once they're wiped out, who's there to stand in their way to put the Temple Mount up there? There's no one. So that tells us that the Temple Mount, if it's not, or the temple is not allowed to be rebuilt on the first seal, it will be by the second seal. And before the middle of the tribulation, it's already up, they're already ministering in it, and it's a done deal. Isn't that good? It's not isn't that good. Isn't that good? Now, that's what's going to happen when the second seal is opened and the rider on the red horse appears. Now, all I have to say is, as we begin to read through these seals, we come to the last verse in chapter 6. We're not there yet, but I want to read this. Go ahead and turn there. Revelation chapter 6. I believe it's verse 17. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who shall be able to stand? Now, if you translate that literally, it says, the tribulation has arrived. And who will be able to live through it? And that's the big question. If you're not ready for Jesus Christ to come back, and he happens to come back, the big question is, can you make it through the tribulation? Who can stand through it. I don't want to be there, and I don't have to be there, and neither do you. If you'll receive Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you don't have to be here when the tribulation takes place. Why? Because Jesus is going to call his church home.